What's up everybody, hope you're all doing well and welcome to my first video on the new Forza Motorsport. Now this one should be pretty simple, but hopefully it'll be helpful for a lot of people because the Forza GT division is very popular in the Forza community and it's actually going to be a permanent playlist and featured multiplayer. So I thought it'd be a good idea just to look at each car that you can use in this division and see how they stack up against each other. So the game assigns upgrades to each of these cars to try to balance them and make them as even in performance as possible. But it kind of misses the mark on some of these. Some of them are a bit overtuned. Some of them are, I'd say, just about right. And some of them need a bit of help. So we're going to rank these and see which ones are worth using, which ones aren't, and talk about some strengths and weaknesses of each. So we have 5 categories here. One is overpowered. Second is strong. Then we have some decent picks, a few weaker picks, and then cars you should avoid for the time being. So before we get started, if you could just drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, that would be greatly appreciated. But with that being said, let's take a look at some of these. So we're just going to start in alphabetical order from manufacturer. So that means we're starting with the Acura. Yeah, so the NSX is a very strong car. It is part of the race day car pack, so if you haven't bought that, you won't be able to use this car, but it is a very strong pick. It doesn't really have any weaknesses at all. It's good on acceleration, top end. The handling is quite good. Braking, the launch, they're all good. It doesn't beat up its tires either. It's just a very solid pick overall, so I think this will go right into the strong category here. So next up is the Aston Vantage. Now this car, it's pretty good. It handles extremely well. It's very easy to drive as well. But the big wing on the back does seem to hurt it a bit on top end. It does kind of fall flat once you get up to higher speeds. But the cornering performance is very good. It's just not the best racing car. So if you have a lead already, you can pull away pretty easily because it does decent lap times, but battling with this car will be a bit of a struggle. It is kind to tires as well though, so it's not a bad pick at all. So I'm going to throw this in the decent category. And then we get to the Audi. Ah yes, I don't think this one needs any explaining. It goes right into the overpowered category. It basically does everything the NSX does, but better. It's an absolute bullet on the straights. The brakes are phenomenal. The corner exit speed is crazy. It's light, so it doesn't beat up the tires. It just does everything right. The car is honestly way overtuned. All the top guys have agreed not to use it because of how good it is. So if you're really desperate for wins, go and pick the Audi. But yeah, I guess there's not much more to say about that. Let's look at the Bentley next. I've tried this quite a bit on some like acceleration based tracks, and it's been okay there, but overall it's just not that great of a pick. Its only redeeming quality is its acceleration. Everything else is pretty mediocre. The top end isn't great. The handling isn't great. It's also a heavier car, so it wears the rear tires significantly. Like if you want your rear tires to survive, you really need to consider using traction control in this car, and even then, it wears worse than the other cars. So this is one I would actually put into the weaker category. Now, when we get to the BMWs, both of these cars are actually very good. I'm going to start with the M6. I enjoy driving this car more than the M8. It does handle very nicely. It could use a little bit more power, I think. That's its one weakness, is it's very average on the straights, but everything else about it is pretty good. It's very easy to drive. It's really good in the corners. Very solid pick overall. So I'm going to put it ahead of the Aston here in the decent category. Next, we get to the M8. And this car caught me by surprise. This car is actually phenomenal in GT division. It's very good on the straights. Its acceleration is strong, got decent top end. Also pretty easy to drive, especially compared to the one in Forza 7, because that car was a bit of a dumpster fire, to be honest. But this car is just all around a great pick. It's also one of the lighter cars, so tire wear isn't an issue. So I think this should go slightly behind the NSX in the strong category. And that's not to say that it's leaps and bounds better than the M6. I think they're actually fairly close, but the split has to be made somewhere for these rankings, so I think this is an appropriate split here. Next we get to the Corvettes. The C7, it's okay. It's in a similar boat to the Aston. It's very easy to drive. It's decent in the corners. It also has a pretty wide power band, lots of torque, so you can be pretty flexible with your gear ratios on this car. But it does lack power. It's one of the few cars that's under 500 horsepower in this division, so it's quite slow on the straights. Which, even if it can do good lap times in a race, that's a huge disadvantage, and you might be battling a lot more than you should based on your pace. So I think picking this car is a little bit of a handicap, but it can do alright lap times in the right hands. So I'm going to put this at the bottom of the decent category behind the Aston. Next we have the C8. This car is also very good. It can run really quick lap times. I think the acceleration's a little lacking, but its mid-corner speed is phenomenal. Probably one of the best in the class. The only issue I have with it really is to balance it, they made the car really heavy in relation to the other cars. So it does chew through tires quicker than others. And at some races where the tire wear is right on the edge for that last lap of a stint, it can really make a difference of like a couple seconds on your in-lap just because of how much worse the tire wear is on this car compared to the others. And for that reason alone, although this is definitely in the strong category, I think I have to place it behind the M8. I know that'll be contentious for some, but even though there's a couple tenths pace advantage in the C8 over the M8, I think that tire wear disadvantage on some tracks more than throws the balance in the M8's favor. The M8's also a bit better on the straight, so a bit better race car too. But the C8 is still a great pick, and you can't go wrong choosing it. Just got to keep those weaknesses in mind. Next, we have the Challenger. Now, the Challenger is quite interesting because it's not a GT car. It's a Trans Am car. But they threw it into this division anyway, so here we are. But it is neutered quite a bit from its stock form. But it still does have quite a bit of power. But it has a lot of downforce, and not necessarily in a good way. It's a very draggy car, so even though it can accelerate alright, it is very weak on top end. It does handle extremely well, though. It's one of the fastest cars in the corners, so if Lime Rock ever comes up in the rotation, it's extremely strong in there. So, with that in mind, I think I would place it right by the Aston, but just a little bit worse. I think the Aston's just a bit more well-rounded of a car, and you can have decent results on more tracks than with the Challenger. The Challenger is also, it's either really strong on short tracks, or it's a bit underwhelming on longer ones, so it's a little bit more hit and miss, so that's why I have it below the Aston. Next is the Viper, and wow, this car, the more I see it, the more I'm impressed with it. This thing is absolutely phenomenal. It's one of the fastest cornering cars in the class. It's got a super wide power band, so you can be flexible with gears just like the C7. It's on rails, honestly. This car is absolutely absurd in high-speed corners. The thing just doesn't lose grip. Any tracks where you benefit from keeping momentum in the corners, this car is just absurdly good. The only real weakness to this car is that it's not the best on the straights, but you carry so much speed out of corners that it kind of makes up for it. So this car, if it had more power, it'd be nearly as good as the Audi, I think. But granted that it doesn't, it's still extremely strong, and I would place it above the M8, probably the third best car in the GT division. Next we have the Ferrari, and I know people don't like this car in the corners, and they think it's difficult to drive, it's not competitive, and so on, but this is actually a sleeper pick. It is extremely fast on a lap. It's honestly as fast as a lot of the strong cars on a lap in qualifying. And it's an absolute bullet on the straight. It's faster than anything here. I think it's almost 10 miles an hour quicker than the Audi on Hakone. Like it's got a ton of power. But to balance out that power, they made it heavy. And as we talked about before, heavy cars, they don't do well with tire wear. And that's this car's glaring flaw. It absolutely shreds its tires to the point where you almost have to choose a compound harder than you would in any other car, which makes it a lot less viable for a race. So while it can set some really good times in qualifying, I'm gonna have to move it in the middle of the decent tier, probably a bit behind the Challenger. It's a pretty good race car for overtaking, but you better be able to hold on to the position in the corners or else you're gonna get eaten alive in this thing. But yeah, it's a sleeper pick. Props to you if you use it. I think it's a decent car if you can get a handle on it. Now we get to another odd pick in the GT division. That's the V8 supercar. All three of these, I don't know why they're here. I guess it's the closest thing they could race in. I'd rather them just add more of these and have a V8 supercar division. But they're in Forza GT for some reason, so we're going to have to deal with it. But this car is just... all three of these are just kind of disappointing. Even though the PI is on par with the others, it's just not very good. It's obviously very quick on the straights. It's like Ferrari fast on the straights, but it has less grip. It can't support all the power that it has without spinning the rear tires. So if you want your rear tires to survive, you almost have to use traction control, or else the rears just get shredded. The straight line speed just does not make up for the lack of cornering performance, and the tire wear just makes it very difficult to successfully race compared to the other cars. So this is going to go into the weaker category. Well, it can still win races. It's just you're basically playing on challenge mode, picking any of the V8s. So not quite an avoid, but definitely harder to succeed with. Next, we have the Ford GT. Now, this car, I haven't had a ton of success with it, but it is actually a very strong pick. I think I just need to put more time into this car. It can run pretty competitive lap times at a lot of tracks, especially like sweeping tracks like Hakone and Maple Valley. It seems to be pretty good on momentum tracks, similar to the Viper, just not quite as good. But it is a really quick car in the right hands if you spend some time with it. I wouldn't put it quite on par with the strong cars, but I'd say it's right about here, right on par with the M6, honestly. If anyone was to put any of these at the bottom of the strong category up here, I wouldn't fault them for it, but I'm just going to place these right at the top of the decent category. Borderline strong, but not quite. And then, continuing with the V8 trend, the Holden is not great. It's actually worse than the Ford. The Ford is the best of the three. The Holden is the worst of the three. It's slower on the straights than the Ford, and it understeers a bit more. It has all the same issues too, so borderline avoid, but I would probably keep it in the weaker category just because it's close enough to the Ford that we can put it there. Next, we have the KTM. This car is a massive sleeper pick. I don't see this car very often at all. It is very hard to set up. But when you get a good setup on this thing, it is an absolute rocket ship. Its launch is incredible, probably the best in the class. The low end Excel is absurd. It does fall on its face a little bit in top end, but even on tracks that need top end, this car just makes up for it elsewhere, and it's still competitive. Honestly, one of the best GT cars you can pick if you can drive it and tune it. So I'm going to slot it in right behind the Viper. It's also the lightest car in the class, so it is a little bit kinder on tires, and you can definitely pull off some no-stop strategies in some of these races if the tire wear lines up correctly. Next, we have the Lamborghini. Now, this is a weird one because, again, it's not a GT car. It's like a track day hypercar thing that they threw into GT by throwing a bunch of ballast at it to try to balance it. And for the most part, it worked, which I'm surprised. It's decent on most tracks. It's absurd in the corners. Like, it's got so much downforce. The mid-corner speed is insane. The acceleration is not great. The launch is horrible. That's the one big downfall. This car is racing it is just an exercise in frustration because it can't accelerate that well, and you almost always lose a couple spots on the launch at the start of a race just because it does not take off. Even if you gear it properly, it does not gain traction like the other cars do. That being said, if this was a Hakone only list, it would be up here because the car is absolutely ridiculous at Hakone. It's faster than the Audi. You have to run a stint on hards with it, but the car is as fast on hards as the other cars are on mediums. And when you do your medium stint, it's just clear. So if it was Hakone only, sure, this car would be completely overpowered. But it's not. So unfortunately, we have to bump it quite a ways down. I would probably put it right about here behind the Ford and ahead of the Aston. Just because some of the lap times it can do are a bit better than the Aston. Again, it still struggles a lot with tire wear. It's probably the worst in the class just because of how heavy it is. But its actual lap time pace is extremely good. Now that I think about it, the Aston actually does launch quite well too. So actually, I'm going to throw the Lambo behind the Aston. Because even as good as it is at Hakone, even Maple Valley when that comes around, you still have to deal with the launch and being relegated to third place at minimum and having to battle through that again before getting in the lead and pulling away. So pace alone doesn't make a car S tier or OP or whatever you want to call it, and this is a prime example of that. Next, we have the last V8 supercar, the Nissan Altima, and this is better than the Holden, but still worse than the Ford. Same issues as the others I've described, so we're just going to slot it right there in the weaker category. And then we get to the Porsches. The 2015 RSR, absolute garbage. This car is horrible. There are no redeeming qualities about it. It is a basket case to drive. It's slow in the corners. It's slow in the straights. It's on par with tire wear, and there's just nothing good about this car. I would avoid it at all costs. If you're going to drive a Porsche, drive one of these two. Now, in contrast to the 2015, the 2017 is a phenomenal car. I haven't had a ton of luck with it. I think I just need to spend some more time with it, but the lap times this thing can do, they're quite frankly ridiculous for what it feels like. It does not feel like a fast car, but when you look at the clock, it's like, wow, this thing is very impressive. So, yeah, it's got no real weaknesses. Maybe it could use a little bit more power, a little down on the straights, but its exit speed out of corners, its launch, all A tier. So I'm going to throw this right behind the C8 in the strong category. And then that leaves us with the final Porsche, the 2018 GT3R. This car, it's quite fast on the straights, similar to the 2017 in exit speed. Not quite the grip that this car has, but it's an okay car. Again, I haven't had much luck with this, and it's also fairly difficult to drive when you have a setup that's required to drive the car quickly. It gets very sketchy. So I think a lot of people are going to struggle with this car, although it is very good in the rain, as is the 2017. So that is a redeeming quality. But overall, I think it leaves a little bit to be desired. So I would throw it right about here, right behind the Ferrari. It's not as fast as the Ferrari on the straights, but it's also similarly difficult to drive. Even with the Ferrari's tire wear in mind, I would probably pick the Ferrari over this in a race. So that's about where I'd place the 2018 GT3R. And that's about it. So I think I'm pretty comfortable with these rankings, having driven all these cars. I think this is a pretty reasonable ranking for these. But if anyone has any different opinions, feel free to post those down in the comments below. Explain why you picked what you did. And that's about all I got for this one, guys. So hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully this helps you pick out some cars for your next GT race. And that's about all I got. So thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I will catch you in the next one. Thanks.